Even before her arrest, Ruby Franke's social media videos providing strict parenting advice garnered a large following, but also raised eyebrows.
Up until now, I was really hoping that keeping them home from school and wiping the floorboards would really bring pain.
Some followers first expressed concerns 3 years ago with an online petition calling for an investigation into Franke.
I told the kids, I said, I'm not even going to let you eat breakfast until you get your chores done.
Now, the 41-year-old mother of 6 is facing criminal charges. And Jodi Hildebrandt, who owns a relationship counseling business, are accused of abusing and starving 2 of Franke's young children. The charges were filed after police said Franke's 12-year-old son climbed out the window of Hildebrandt's home and ran to a nearby house asking for food and water. The neighbor called 911.
I think he's been detained. He's obviously covered in wounds.
Authorities say the juvenile appeared to be emaciated and malnourished with open wounds and duct tape around the extremities. When police searched Hildebrandt's home, they say they also found Franke's 10-year-old daughter in a similar physical condition of...
Welcome to my channel, Outspoken Samantha. If you are new here, welcome. I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button. And if you're returning, welcome back. I truly do appreciate your continued support on my channel, and I hope that you are subscribed as well. So we are going to continue talking about the arrest of Ruby Franke and her business partner, Jodi Hildebrandt, and get into some new information that has come out specifically about Jodi Hildebrandt, but just some new developments in the case in general. And if you haven't watched my first video on this case, I did release it just a few days ago, and I do recommend watching that one first. But just as a little bit of a recap, this is Ruby Franke, and she is a famous family vlogger out of Utah who ran a massively popular YouTube channel called 8 Passengers. And over the course of its 7-year existence on YouTube, the family uploaded over 1,200 videos for the viewing pleasure of their 2.3 million subscribers. These videos primarily focused on the 6 Franke children, Sherry, Chad, Abby, Julie, Russell, and Eve, and they just had a lot of fun, I guess, making videos about the daily life of their family. And what drew people to this channel was what draws people to most family vlogging channels, was just the recording of their regular activities as a family, such as vacations, doing their schoolwork, having meal times, preparing meal times, going on grocery trips, and just doing other fun activities like birthdays and family get-togethers. But in the case of this specific channel, what really started to get people's attention was the way that Ruby and Kevin parented their children, often using punishments and forms of discipline that viewers felt were over the top and way, way, way too harsh, especially for someone like Ruby Franke, who felt the need to not only record herself carrying out these disciplinary tactics, but also at the same time tell everyone that what she was doing was the proper way to raise your kids, and that if you had a problem with her methods, it's not because what she was doing was actually severe or just flat out wrong, or because she was being too hard on her kids, but because we're all just too soft.
Go get dressed for football.
You're gonna have to go find your shorts. Oh, did you see the socks you threw at the side of the garden? And you are not going anywhere unless you pick up your junk. You've got crap strewn all around. Now, so you see, now I'm using bad language. That's how bad of a mood I'm in. You get your socks picked up and don't you leave your stuff out anymore.
Where?
Right over there. Run and go pick them up. And then give me 10 push-ups. Put them in your pocket so you can take them down to the hamper and drop and give me 10.
1.
Put your hands straight out. They're in. They're not supposed to be out. Shape your hands forward. There you go. 1, 2, down further, bring your butt down.
Ooh.
If you cut one more thing in my house, I'm going to take the scissors, look at me, and I'm going to cut its head off.
Grandma, you're so bad.
So what are you going to do?
Are you going to cut anything else? No.
So one of the questions that has been asked repeatedly is, why did so many people support this channel for so long when clearly this mom is totally unhinged, and watching her videos would just keep putting money in her pocket and make her think that what she was doing was validated because people must be watching me, so it must be fine. And I honestly think there are a few reasons as to why people continued to watch this channel. First of all, Ruby is clearly an attractive person, so that is going to bring in more viewers whether we want to admit it or not. Second of all, there is this car accident syndrome to it. It's like the disaster we know we shouldn't be staring at, but we can't help it because we can't believe that it's actually happening and we're witnessing it firsthand. And this was a wreck that just kept happening over and over and over again, and it was fascinating and horrifying at the same time that this woman would just keep posting these things, truly believing that what she was doing was okay. Third, I think that the more concerned people got, they saw watching these videos as a means of checking on the kids and making sure that they were still okay. And fourth, and I think this is one of the biggest reasons, is that there was such a shocking contrast between this woman who appeared to have it all together. She had a beautiful home, good-looking kids, they were well off and had an overall perfect life. They were people that were religious and active in their church. And compared to what they were actually doing in their home, like how they conducted themselves as parents seemed to fall in such a stark contrast to what they wanted us to believe was real with their image. They wanted us to believe they were perfect. They appeared to be perfect, yet their kids were clearly dealing with psychological abuse. They appeared to have it all figured out, yet their kids were clearly struggling. They lectured everyone else about how to raise their kids, yet people were reporting them to CPS for how they treated their own. And they wanted to tell everyone how to create this perfect family, yet their own daughter stopped talking to them as soon as she could. And she was the first one to post on social media that she was glad when her mom was arrested. We were watching polar opposite things play out at exactly the same time. Like, you say you want to teach your kids compassion, yet you tell them they need to starve if they leave their lunch at home. You get mad at your son for thinking a prank on his little brother is funny, yet you laugh when he says you made him sleep on a beanbag for months, and then you wonder where he learned to think cruelty is funny. And as we know at this point, this all came to a head on August 30th when Ruby Franke was arrested after her 12-year-old son Russell climbed out of a window of the home of Jodi Hildebrandt, where Ruby had been staying with her kids, and he ran to the neighbor's house for food, for water, and to get help.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here at my front door asking for help. And he's said he just came from a neighbor's house, and we know there's been problems at this neighbor's house. He's emaciated, he's got tape around his legs, he's hungry, and he's thirsty.
Okay. Is your door locked?
No, I'm sitting outside with him on the front patio.
Okay, cool.
And he asked us to call the police.
What's
So
his
he's
name?
very afraid.
Are the neighbors out of their home, or is anybody looking for them that you can see?
No. Our homes are far enough away. I'm not sure. How did you get out of the house?
Porch. He went out.
He says he just left through the porch at the neighbor's house. Her name is Jodi Hildebrandt, and she lives 2 doors up the street.
Out here in Cayenne, the houses are far apart.
Yeah, out in Cayenne, the houses are far apart, so he walked just under a block to get to our house. He rang my doorbell and asked me to call the police.
Now, the vast majority of the focus thus far has been on Ruby Franke, and that's the way it should be, because regardless of the role that Jodi Hildebrandt played in all of this, these are Ruby's kids, and as a parent, it is your job to protect your kids, regardless of who else is in their life. So while we are going to be talking about Jodi Hildebrandt a lot in this video, none of this is to take away the attention from Ruby Franke, because as we all know by now, there are years and years and years of clips from her 8 Passengers family vlogging channel, and people were making complaints to CPS based on her unhinged parenting tactics long before Jodi Hildebrandt ever entered the picture. However, the role of Jodi Hildebrandt is extremely important in all of this, and we cannot allow all of the focus on Ruby to take attention away from Jodi, because Oh boy, this woman is a trip, and she should have been put behind bars a long time ago, and she, I'm sure, would love it if Ruby took the fall for all of this. But honestly, if she had been put behind bars a long time ago, while the unhinged parenting tactics of Ruby Franke on her kids probably would have continued, I honestly don't believe that it would have escalated to the point that it did had she and Jodi never crossed paths. Understanding Jodi Hildebrandt and her dark history makes more of this situation make sense. Well, as much as it's possible for something this unbelievable to make sense, but it also leaves some very, very important questions about who is responsible for all of this and who actually does deserve the weight of the blame. So just as a little background on Jodi Hildebrandt, she founded the ConneXions classroom in 2007. Prior to that, she worked as a counselor at a drug and alcohol treatment center. On her LinkedIn profile, she is listed as a therapist and educator, and she has a Master's of Science in Educational Psychology that she earned from the University of Utah in 2003. And I actually do need to correct something that I said in my first video, because I was under the impression that Jodi and Ruby founded ConneXions Classroom together. I knew that Jodi had been a mental health professional of some kind for a long time before that, but I thought that this was something they created together. I didn't know that Jodi had actually been running it for years and years before Ruby came into the picture. And as I've been trying to piece this timeline together, it sounds to me like Ruby connected with Jodi about 2 or 3 years ago, which is significant, but was not promoted to this mental health advisor on the platform until about a year ago, which is also significant. But just one of the many bizarre aspects of this story is the fact that Jodi was an actual mental health professional with a license and a degree and all the things that actually make her legitimate in this field. So it's weird that she would elevate someone like Ruby to be a partner of hers that had no credentials in this field whatsoever. And not only that, the person that she chose to elevate had hundreds of videos online showing themselves to be a cruel nutcase of a mother when it came to the parenting of her own children. Most mental health professionals would see Ruby Franke's videos and go, yeah, that person probably shouldn't even be allowed to raise their own children, let alone give advice to anyone else, let alone be elevated as some kind of expert whose behavior should be emulated between all parents and their kids. But for some reason, Jodi Hildebrandt saw Ruby's narcissistic and manipulative behavior towards her own kids and thought, that's exactly who I need as a partner when it comes to counseling and advising people on how to raise their kids. But as we're learning more about Jodi Hildebrandt, it's not really surprising that she would immediately click with someone like Ruby Franke. So as I said, we can absolutely not let Jodi take any less heat than Ruby, because there are people who are now coming forward who have had past very in-depth experiences with Jodi and her so-called treatments as a therapist, and what she has put others through are mirrored exactly in what Russell and Eve Franke went through. This woman has been inflicting pain and horror on kids and teens and families for years. In her career as a therapist, this woman has nothing but wreckage and devastation and broken families in her wake. It's kind of like the thugs from the Home Alone movies who go into all of these homes and rob them, and they leave their mark by plugging the drains and flooding the building before they walk out. But you can tell exactly every place that they've hit because every home is ruined. And that's pretty much what Jodi Hildebrandt's past looks like. This is Jodi's niece, Jessi, and she's come forward to share her own personally horrifying experience in being professionally treated by Jodi Hildebrandt. And she has said she is finally being listened to and validated for what happened to her years ago. So apparently when she was about 15 or 16 years old, Jessi's own parents sought out Jodi for help with their daughter. They took Jessi for a visit, and while Jessi was asleep one night, Jodi told her parents that the best thing they could do was leave, and Jodi would take the lead on Jessi's treatment. So her parents left without a word, and Jessi was later woken up by Jodi and her grandparents and told that her parents had left her behind and that her life was about to change. The therapy that followed was identical to what the young Franke children were found to have been in the middle of, being bound, duct taped, starved, and left in isolation.
It's interesting to watch I understand this, but it's interesting to watch the world respond to her and kind of putting her at the forefront. And I understand that she's the mother of these children, and it makes sense. But the philosophies and the therapeutic modalities that she's using are Jodi's. And these are not new. These are not, this is a pattern that Jodi has been engaged with for at least 14 years. I don't know if there are other people that she's used these on, but she's definitely taught. I know that she teaches parents to use these types of therapies, as she would call them. So yeah, it's been a really interesting experience watching everyone focus on Ruby, and I understand why, but this is Jodi. These are Jodi's words. These are Jodi's ideas. These are over decades old. So that doesn't excuse Ruby's involvement and her perpetuating these beliefs and these systems, but Ruby didn't come up with this. Ruby obviously supports it and has used these on her children. But this is coming from Jodi.
So Jessi does go on to describe in detail what she went through under Jodi's care. And I do want to give a trigger warning because she does describe severe levels of abuse that are similar to what we know that Russell and Eve were dealing with. But she does go a little bit further. So if that's something that might bother you, just skip ahead about a minute or so.
So the things that I experienced while living with Jodi, I experienced being tied. I experienced being duct taped. I experienced being blindfolded. I experienced severe isolation. I experienced severe emotional, spiritual, and psychological abuse. I experienced the being told I shouldn't be around other people, being told that I was dangerous to be around. People were afraid of me to the point where I was afraid of myself. I was physically, I was forced to sleep outside in the snow. I was, like I said, isolated for up to 12 hours a day. If someone spoke to me directly, if I wasn't wearing duct tape on my mouth, I had to just stare at them and not respond, because she also had systems of people that would report back to her if I broke any of these rules.
And there was another podcast where she did go into further detail about her story and says that part of this therapy, everything that mattered to her was taken away from her, and everything that gave her confidence and joy was taken away from her. And of course, this is exactly the kind of thing that Ruby regularly liked to do long before getting together with Jodi. Ruby took football away from Chad and Christmas away from her two youngest kids. She took their beds away. She took food away. She took their homework away. She took away technology. It was just this constant method of control to remove things from them. And there are videos of her kids talking about how they didn't even have friends anymore, likely because in Ruby's paranoia, she felt that they were going to be a negative influence on her kids, but also their friends may have just gotten tired of dealing with their friend's insane mother. Who knows? But while Ruby was not as extreme for most of this time, it's no wonder that she would feel that the natural progression of things, after spending years depriving her own kids of things to force them to behave, and probably not feeling like it was working, the next step would be to work with someone who would escalate that discipline. But back to Jessi.
And her whole thing, which is deeply, darkly ironic, is that everything stems from shame and how horrible shame is. And that all of the reason, like all of mental illness, all tics, so like OCDs, addiction, everything stems from shame. Which is just horrifying, because she is the greatest perpetuator of shame.
So I think based on what Jodi's niece Jessi went through, I think it's safe to say that Jodi Hildebrandt is a sick and twisted human being, and she has a long history of imposing these kinds of tactics as a method of discipline. What Ruby and Jodi have in common is that they both have a very, very tunnel vision view of what the right path is, and that any child who sets even a toenail off that path is seen as sinful and problematic. And the only way to correct this child is through severe tactics. Ruby's was to do things like withhold food and use faith manipulation and other methods of psychological control, whereas Jodi apparently believed in physical restraint, isolation, starvation, and gaslighting. Either way, For both of them, the goal is to completely rewire the brains of these problematic kids. And not only that, they both feel that these extreme measures to force kids to obey are just as good or even better than just simply being compassionate and loving to your kids, so that they learn that kind of behavior from you modeling it to them. And these two lunatics liked to climb up on their self-righteous soapbox and create videos and podcasts for their followers, having them believe that they were both doing a great job of keeping Ruby's kids from slipping into distortion. Yet the real distortion was the fact that they actually believed their methods were working, and that these reformed kids were making choices because they were learning their lesson and correcting their mindset. When in reality, they were likely only going along with what Ruby and or Jodi wanted and making good choices because they wanted to avoid what these two liked to call natural consequences that came from disobeying these narcissistic manipulators who would have no problem starving them or making them sleep on the cold floor if they didn't go along with it. So Ruby and Jodi were the ones living an entire world of distortion the whole time because everything they said was real and the image they were portraying to their classroom was a total farce, and everything they implied that they were accomplishing with Ruby's kids was a lie. Let's keep going.
Because of what the abuse and torturing that was going on, and the belief that she had that I was doing something more. So her rationale to the severity of these punishments and this physical and emotional abuse was she wanted to make my life, and this is like her quote, like this is what she would tell me all of the time. She wanted to make my life so uncomfortable that it would force the sin out, that it would force me to confess. So things continuously got worse and worse and progressively more and more intense as a way to get me to confess, because she believed that if I had confessed everything, if all of my sins were out and in the open, that I would be getting better.
And to me, this is why Ruby and Jodi clicked, because Ruby already had this belief that using extreme punishments or allowing kids to suffer was a way of pushing them to the edge. And I honestly think she felt that being extreme was the only way to push sin out, or to push any inclination that her kids might feel whatsoever to make what she felt were poor decisions, and that being extreme would completely eliminate any temptation that they might feel to do something that she felt was bad. And it kind of answers the question as to how Jodi and Ruby ended up in this business partnership, because clearly they had a lot in common. But a question that has not been answered yet is who initiated that business relationship. Did Jodi see Ruby online and say, she and her kids are the perfect candidates for my therapies? Or was Ruby getting desperate to correct her kids' behavior because to her it wasn't improving to what her expectations for them were? So she sought out this therapist who would gladly do whatever it took to achieve the outcome that Ruby wanted for her kids. We just don't know. And if it's possible, what Jessi says next is even more shocking. And again, I'm going to give you a massive trigger warning right here, because she will be talking about things that are sexually explicit. So skip ahead about a minute if you feel like this might bother you. There's no judgment.
She accused me of being a sex addict. She accused me of being addicted to masturbation, to the point where I wasn't allowed to, I mentioned this on the podcast, to the point where I wasn't allowed to use tampons. I never was allowed privacy unless I was isolated. So that included the bathroom. I was never allowed to have the door closed because she was convinced that I was just constantly masturbating. She was convinced that I was addicted to porn. I had never seen porn at that point in my life. I didn't even know that people with my anatomy could masturbate. Like I had no idea any of this stuff, but I just believed her because she used religion and God as a mode of control, and a mode to manipulate. And so I just believed all of these things. So her ability to convince you of these neuroticisms and these behaviors and I was a teenager. And so a child in that position of being told this over and over and over and over again, which I'm certain he was, stood no chance.
So to me, this is relevant, aside from showing just how sick and depraved Jodi is as a person, but relevant to the bizarre and incredibly random and very out of place accusation that Ruby chose to make about her own child and his supposed addictions during their initial hearing on September 8th. If you're not aware, during that first hearing for Jodi and Ruby, which happened on September 8th, so just a few days ago, instead of focusing on her own actions that led to her being arrested, and I'm referring to Ruby, and live by her constant call to others to live in truth and face the truth of her own behavior, she decided to announce to the court that her child was a sexual predator who had been watching porn since the age of 3 and had been molesting his own siblings and countless other neighborhood children for years. The question is, why would you feel that this would be an appropriate time to bring this up? Because if it is true, you just told the court that you as a mother knew that your child had a problem and you did nothing to fix it. And is this really something that was happening for years? Or, as Ruby was telling Jodi about her children participating in unspeakable things, like doing a flash mob TikTok dance at school, or maybe just watching a cartoon that she didn't approve of and thought was evil, did Jodi convince Ruby that these things that would be considered innocent and harmless by most of our standards was actually a porn addiction in her child, and that other normal things that her children were doing were actually sexually predatory behavior toward other kids, and that her kid was a monster? Because this would then convince an already paranoid and controlling person like Ruby that these extreme therapies were necessary for her son in order to save him. I could just see it playing out that way. Jodi really played a huge role in bringing this stuff down on the Franke children. And again, that is not to let Ruby Franke off the hook in any way, because it takes a certain kind of person to let someone convince them that normal behaviors of a child are actually signs of them being sick and evil, and allow that person to bind them and starve them as a form of treatment. I'm just saying that this might offer an explanation, though not a good one, as to why Ruby would just blurt something like that out in court. In a court appearance about her, it's almost like she feels that that would offer some kind of justification as to why her children were found in the state that they were in, because they were going through treatment. And if they didn't, they would be a danger to others.
And so to hear Ruby tell the world that her child is a sex addict, a predator, and has been addicted to porn since he was 3 years old, it just echoes exactly the things that she was telling me and telling everyone around me. And I know that I think if I don't know if I got this right, but I'm pretty sure that she's saying that he even confessed to it. Well, I also confessed to things that I didn't do as a way of trying to get the abuse to stop. Because when she's like drilling it into you both psychologically and physically that there's more, and it will stop once you tell her, because that's what she would tell you. Like in the middle of the abuse, she'd be like, I'll stop as soon as you tell me.
And the last part of what she says also confirms that these two lunatics were the ones living in distortion, because it truly didn't matter to them if they were actually influencing these kids to be better people. These kids were just saying whatever they had to say to survive.
Dear Heavenly Father, please help me to survive.
But they weren't actually being molded into the people that Ruby and Jodi thought they were.
So I just started making things up as a way, as like trying to get this to stop, because I had no one there to help me and to save me. And I think I even said that on the podcast, that I was making things up. And when I spoke to the detective down in St. George days ago, I told her that as well. It's like and so even if he had confessed, it cannot be taken seriously, because this child was being tortured. And I'm certain that she echoed those words of like, if you tell me, I will stop.
And unfortunately, what happens in the 911 call that the neighbor made as he was sitting there with Russell shows that the impact that Jodi and Ruby were having on this child was actually working in the same way.
Okay. So they're able to walk around the house and everything. Well, okay. He says everything's fine with them. Grain of salt.
Okay.
He says what's happened to him is his fault. He's fine. I've got him sitting here. My wife, he got him water and giving him something to eat, because he's hungry, and I think the young man, he's hearing his stocking feet. So He escaped.
I'm also just really blown away by these accusations that Ruby just flung out in court about her child. And unfortunately, it could end up being one more way that to harm him for the rest of his life.
The thing that's so sinister about this is that it can't be disproven. So even if like she goes to prison, you know, his name is cleared, it will never be fully cleared because it cannot be disproven. So this is going to potentially follow him for the rest of his life. So even with those children being taken out of her care, she is still abusing them. And so with whatever is happening, whatever did happen, I can guarantee you it's not what she's saying.
I really won't get anything for summer. I won't be able to go anywhere. You know, I don't have any friends.
That's the little boy that she's accusing right there. Just let that sink in. And Jessi did say it was actually Ruby's accusation of her son being this sexual predator that pushed her over the edge, and that's what moved her to come forward. She wants to make sure that this child is heard and not smeared because of the accusations of a clearly unhinged person, and that he does not face the same fate as she did with not being listened to for years, because the person with the master's degree has more credibility than she does. Interestingly, there could be action that the son could take against Ruby in the future, and I really hope he does.
If this is totally false, and this is just a wild, outlandish claim, could a minor child have a legal action against a parent like this?
Yes, I think so. And I think the cause of action would be stayed until that child hits adulthood. So I don't think the not to be too technical about this, but I think the child does not have to move with the alacrity that anybody else, that an adult would have to move. I think there's a legal presumption that allows him to go to adulthood before the statute of limitations clock begins to run. But yes, I absolutely do think the child has a cause of action against the mother for defamation and for, could be, you know, physical battery and all kinds of other civil versions of the criminal charges that have been filed.
So with all that being said, we do need to talk about Kevin again, because he's the father. So there's a lot of questions that we need to have answered. He does have an attorney, and his attorney has done several media interviews at this point as we're trying to get these questions answered. Like, what did he know? How could he allow this to happen? Is it even possible that he didn't know? Now, we all saw Kevin be this willing participant in these over-the-top parenting methods with Ruby. It's not like he was just a spectator or he sat on the sidelines, and he never stepped in to maybe point out that perhaps things were going too far, and he went along with it and he encouraged it.
Today has just entered the Anasazi Foundation Wilderness Therapy Program, where he's going to spend the next 8 to 10 weeks living in the
Anasazi Desert.
Yeah, the desert mountains of Arizona.
However, he does confirm what the oldest daughter, Sherry Franke, said in a podcast when he said that things did change rapidly for the worse when Jodi Hildebrandt came into the picture. And based on what we heard from Jessi, there is really no reason to question that. Jodi apparently just makes everyone's lives worse. Great therapist. So this is an interview with Kevin's attorney, Randy Kester, which he gave on a program called Sidebar, and he offers Kevin's perspective on things. So his attorney says that Kevin and Ruby had been separated for 13 months before the arrest happened. When asked why they separated, the attorney said that it was too personal to go into the details about it, but there were aspects of disagreement about how to parent their kids, and also there were issues in their relationship as a couple. He also said that Ruby told Kevin that in order to salvage their marriage, it would be better if Kevin was no longer in the home, and that any communication he could have during the separation period would be initiated by her, that she would allow communication between Kevin and her or Kevin and the kids if and when it was needed. Kevin said that he has not seen or spoken to his kids or Ruby since then. That is, until she reached out to him just before he was arrested.
He got a call from Ruby.
He got a call from Ruby Franke.
Correct.
You mean while she was, after she was arrested?
Before.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. She had heard what was going on, and knew they were coming for her and called him and said, "This is an emergency," even though she hadn't reached out to him for months and months and months before that. She reached out to him when it was an emergency, knowing she could rely on him to help his kids.
So in other words, you're saying she knew the police were coming to arrest her. She calls Kevin to say, take care of the kids. How did she know the police were coming? Because again, the reporting indicates is that her son had escaped that house and called and went to a neighbor, and that's when the authorities were alerted. Do you know how she knew they were coming?
I would never want to predict anything that she might know. Kevin doesn't know. He doesn't know. I don't know how she knew what was going down. All he knows is he got a text from her that said, "Emergency, need to speak with you." He was at work and text back and said, "I'm at work. What's up?" And she said, "I need to speak to you immediately."
And then they spoke on the phone.
Correct.
Now, in that conversation, apparently, Ruby said to Kevin, "You need to get down here." And he's like, "Get down where?" And when she told him, "You need to get to Ivan's," he was like, "What are you doing in Ivan's?" So he says he didn't know that Ruby and her kids were living with Jodi at her home in Ivan's. But I'm just wondering, because it was said that Ruby was arrested in Springville, which was almost 4 hours away from Ivan's. So I guess she was telling him to go to Ivan's to be with his kids because she was going to end up behind bars. But the guy asks, like, did Ruby know she was about to be arrested? I mean, Jodi had just been taken in, so I'm interested to know how Ruby found out she was next when she was 300 miles away. Also, why was she so far away? That's not something that I don't think that's been answered either. Perhaps she had left her kids there at the direction of Jodi because it's part of Jodi's treatment plan to get parents to leave their kids with her so she can help them. Still wondering about that. Kevin's attorney goes on to insist that Kevin had no idea that this was happening to his kids, and while I do find that hard to believe, there's honestly no telling what's possible when you get someone that's as sick and twisted as Jodi Hildebrandt involved with your family. I believe that Ruby had taken the kids to live with Jodi for the summer, which is something she did not tell Kevin that she was doing. And this also lines up with the timeline of when Ruby says her son supposedly confessed these sins to her, which she said he came to her with at the beginning of May. So this may have been the time when Jodi said, "It's time for the Jodi Hildebrandt special. Bring your kid to my house and we'll take care of this." And this might be when the treatment that was similar to what Jessi said happened to her was forced on Russell and Eve, because there's definitely a pattern here. And it will eventually come out on whether or not it's true that he didn't know, but this is what his attorney had to say on that.
Kevin never had any reason to believe that his children were being abused. If he had even one inkling that his kids were being abused and that this separation wasn't for any other purpose than to figure out a way between he and Ruby to reunite their family, he would have been down there in 2 seconds.
Do they
he just
currently
simply had no idea.
He had no idea. He had no idea that this was going on.
No, physical abuse had never been a part of their family.
No, just starvation and withholding their basic needs, taking things they loved, faith manipulation, letting them think that if bad things happen, it's because God was punishing them or scaring them into being faithful by telling them that if they prayed, nothing bad would ever happen, nor never allowing them any kind of privacy. See, Kevin, people are going to have a hard time believing that you didn't know about this because you supported all of the cruel and abusive punishments with your wife the entire time. You never stood up for your kids and you never had their back. So why should we believe that you have a problem with this next level punishment when you had no problem with anything going on up until now? When you have no boundaries on how your kids are treated up until the point that it gets physical, why would anyone believe that you would have any kind of boundaries at all? Kevin really cannot blame people for being extremely skeptical of him right now. He goes on to say that after the last conversation with Ruby, which he says was last Friday, which would have been the 9th, I think, Kevin supposedly came to his senses about how much he had been deceived by Jodi.
What does he say about Jodi Hildebrandt?
That she's manipulated him in conjunction with Ruby, that she's been kind of the spearhead toward essentially destroying his life and destroying his family.
So we're definitely getting this picture that Jodi is just a walking torpedo and she just takes down whoever gets near, which blows my mind because this person has been running a website and a platform for years based on advising parents and trying to teach them how to raise their kids to be good people, which is just incomprehensible. But I do have to admit that this next point in the interview is kind of what made my head explode.
So even putting aside the arrest of Ruby Franke, your client was receiving criticism for quite some time over the parenting techniques. What has his response been to that?
There hasn't ever been an allegation that Kevin Franke has ever physically abused his children. And I think all these parenting complaints, those were investigated, and I think it's a subjective thing. Parenting, as everybody says, no one's ever written the perfect book on parenting.
Yes, parenting is subjective, and the complaints were never about these two not being perfect parents. So don't insult our intelligence. Both of these parents, both of them, were psychologically abusive to these kids for years. The sisters of Ruby Franke said they had concerns about these kids for a long time, long before Jodi came into the picture. Viewers were shocked and horrified at what they thought was inappropriate treatment of their children. Neighbors were convinced that if something wasn't done, that the only way the Franke children would ever make it out of their parents' home was in body bags. Yes, Jodi is evil and vile and clearly very good at pulling people into her clutches and ruining their lives and getting them to ruin their own lives. But we don't get to pretend that what Kevin and Ruby were doing was okay and that people were only complaining simply because it's not what they would do in their own home. Regardless of the various ways in which people raise their kids, all of these people were unified on the fact that what the Frankes were doing was insane. And not all abuse is physical. And that right there kind of solidifies to me as to why Kevin Franke should not get these kids back, because clearly he felt that the treatment was only problematic after Jodi came into the picture, but there was no issue with anything that happened for the years and years beforehand. Just because there were no charges filed does not mean that there wasn't a problem. As I said in my last video, manipulating your kids is not a crime. Belittling your kids and making them feel as worthless as possible is not a crime. Making your child sleep on the cold bathroom floor when they're sick, even though you should be comforting them and helping them, is not a crime. Telling your kids that they own nothing and have no right to anything in their home is not a crime. But that does not mean that harm was not being inflicted on these kids. And just because no one accused him of physical abuse does not mean that abuse wasn't happening. But there have been other victims of Jodi's that have decided to come forward because clearly they see that this woman is finally getting what she deserves.
Hearing from another former client who says this is just the beginning.
He believes a lot more former clients will come forward with their stories of both shame and isolation.
Yeah, Paul Nelson tells us more about this part of the story. Paul?
Well, I am also right outside the Division of Professional Licensing. We'll explain why in just a little bit. However, the former client that we spoke with, his name is Trey Warner, and he says that Jodi Hildebrandt was really good at using shaming tactics to pit husband and wives against each other. And he also says that she was very good at convincing people that they were dangerous for other people to be around. The angry comments coming into the ConneXions Classroom social media pages now are just the beginning, according to former client Trey Warner. He joined a support group at the recommendation of a friend trying to improve his marriage. But after a while, he says he grew more suspicious of what Jodi Hildebrandt was teaching.
It started to feel more and more evil. And I finally, in one of the group meetings, I got up and I just said, this is off.
Warner claims Hildebrandt would use shaming tactics to turn husbands and wives against each other, adding that she would convince men that their impure thoughts made them dangerous to their families. He says he saw one case during a group session.
There was a man that had a successful business that believed that he was a danger to his wife and his family because he did a double take. As a woman, like if he saw a beautiful woman, he would see and he'd look again. This guy got his own apartment and separated from his family because he was a danger.
So it seems as though Jodi Hildebrandt's therapy method was to separate and destroy. And the timelines that seem to go together is when Ruby and Kevin separated may have been around the time that Ruby was elevated in this ConneXions classroom. And it may have been under the direction of Jodi that Ruby should kick Kevin out of the house and tell him not to contact her or the kids unless Ruby reached out, and that this was a necessary part of this family therapy. Again, not excusing Ruby, just pointing to where we can see Jodi's handprints all over the crime scene. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Bonnie and Ellie, which are two of Ruby's sisters. And I did touch on this briefly in my last video, and the initial response to Bonnie, because she is the one that posted a video on Instagram just after all of this fell apart, was not very kind. And I know that I was part of that. I was not nice to her in my last video. I think I shared a lot of frustrations that other people had based on the impression that we were getting from her video, which was not great. But from what it looked like, her reaction sounded very, very detached and self-centered. In it, she really focused on wanting to get back to her regularly scheduled content for her own family vlogging channel. And it definitely gave this impression that she wanted to address this issue as quickly as possible, almost out of obligation, but that she wanted to move on from this whole thing as quickly as she possibly could, and to not allow the drama of what her sister was going through impact her image and her reputation and her channel. And I honestly think that she put out that video as quickly as she did because she wanted to say something. But ultimately, you know, when we're blindsided with something that's completely chaotic and everything just feels like it is crashing down in one foul swoop, I get that perhaps in those initial days or weeks, you're probably not going to say what you would have said had you sat back and actually processed things first. And again, I was one of those people that was really, really hard on her based on this video because there were things that she said that just did not make sense. And it just sounded like everyone in these kids' lives were just failing them, even their extended family, including the two sisters who had platforms just like Ruby. And I am glad that since then that both Bonnie and Ellie have paused their content for at least the last couple of weeks and had time to gather their thoughts. And then they did decide to go on and create videos for YouTube to offer us a little bit more insight as to what they knew and what Bonnie meant in the original video when she said that they had been struggling with what was going on in Ruby's family for years, but didn't know the extent of the harm being done, and address this question as to why they didn't do more to stop it. Because I know a lot of us were like, wait, you said you knew that things were bad for years, but didn't get the kids out of there, and then you waited until one of your nephews had to escape before acknowledging it? It just didn't make any sense, and it doesn't help that the internet is just not a kind place. And in a situation where children are being abused and starved and neglected, it's hard to grant anyone grace who may have had the power to stop it, and any kind of grace unless they have a darn good reason for not putting a stop to it. So again, both Bonnie and Ellie have posted videos in response to some of the backlash that they have been receiving, and I'm going to play a small piece of each of their videos, but I will leave links to the full videos in the description box below. So both videos are several minutes long, and I have to say, after hearing from them, I am absolutely willing to take a step back and give them a little bit more understanding. So this first one is Bonnie.
Possible video to make. I know that my words will be used against me. I also know that my words may help people understand me a little. I can only speak for myself, and I will only be speaking for myself, other than the judge has asked us not to speak on certain topics that I will not be touching on. The first thing that I want to say is that we have kept quiet for 3 years on the topic of our sister Ruby and Jodi and Kevin and ConneXions. That is what we have stayed quiet about. We did not know what they were doing because, like we said, we were cut off. We did not have access to anyone. My thoughts towards Ruby and Jodi and Kevin and ConneXions is that it was all bullcrap. It wasn't until about a year ago when we were able to reconnect with Sherry. Again, we kept that quiet. We never came out and said anything. You guys saw us together, and those were little glimpses when Sherry was ready to allow us to show those glimpses with her permission. And it was then that we were learning slowly bits and pieces of more. And that's where the part of behind the scenes, we did everything that we could. We did everything legally that we could do. And for those that were saying that they'd go in and bust down doors and do whatever it took to end up in jail, because from jail, I can't do anything. So I still stand by what I said, is that I did everything that I could with the knowledge that I had and within the legal rights to Ruby and Kevin. The one person that could have done something within his legal right was Kevin. We had zero contact with him. It was Kevin's job to check in on things, and he did not. So when I say that Ruby and Kevin and Jodi and ConneXions have been destroying our lives offline for the last 3 years, that is exactly what they've been doing. This has hurt every single person in our family. Ago, Ruby and Kevin cut our family off, and eventually they cut Kevin's family. 3 years ago, Ruby and Kevin cut our family off, and eventually they cut Kevin's family off as well. And I thought that was going to end my mom. She literally had a heart attack. She went into kidney failure. Her body was shutting down because it broke her. So you can only imagine what she is going through now, how we are all feeling now. And I'll only speak for myself, but Ruby and Kevin are not where my concern lies anymore. So it is difficult to have the blame put on us when these are not the actions of us. These are not the actions that we did. And I get people wanting to put blame somewhere. I do. They want to blame someone. There's only one person that could have helped, and he didn't. What he was doing all that time when him and Ruby were separated is beyond me.
And this is Ellie's video.
3 years ago, Ruby, everything was great. It seemed to be fine anyway. We were a typical family. She was getting some therapy counseling because their family needed it, which I think is great. However, I think you need to get it from a great source. Read the reviews. Jodi Hildebrandt and her website or therapy style, I don't know what you want to call it, ConneXions, was not a great resource. And we all saw it. We all felt weird about this Jodi lady. We weren't comfortable with it. We didn't like it. We didn't like the teachings Ruby was bringing to the family functions, and we were this close to telling her, if you come to our family events anymore, we do not want to hear what you were learning through ConneXions because we don't like it. We never did say that to her, but we thought it. Anyway, so 3 years ago, Ruby and I hung out bottling tomatoes, and then a few weeks later, crap hit the fan and she left the family. And she didn't even call me to say, hey, you know, Julie, you're doing this and this, I don't like it, you're living your life in distortion, so I'm gonna have to take some time away from you. No, literally nothing. She did call my mom and yelled at my mom on the phone for 45 minutes and accused her of things that were not true. It was almost as if Ruby had been making up memories from her childhood. She was trying to grab at anything she could, and she would exaggerate on everything. So she started all of her lies back then, lying to everyone in her life, getting rid of all of her friends and family, and I literally had no contact with her. She wouldn't respond to any texts or emails over the time that I tried reaching out to her. Never got a response from her. So I was very fortunate to have been able to reach out to her daughter Sherry once she was an adult, and we were able to form a really close, strong relationship, which I am grateful for. And it was then that I learned more about Ruby, and it was then that Sherry had learned about lies that had been told to her. I feel like me and my other sisters have said, we feel like we've just been kind of floating on a cloud here these past few weeks. We are in complete shock still as to what she had done, because we had no idea of what was happening. Basically, I'm here to say that I had no idea what was happening. Like Bonnie mentioned in her video, we are not going to let Ruby destroy another thing in our lives.
So both of them confirm the same thing, that they had no idea what was going on because Ruby completely cut them off 3 years ago. And when Bonnie said in her original video that we all went after her for, that she and her sisters clung to each other over the last few years, and we're wondering why were you clinging to each other and not just getting the kids out of there, this was because they were completely in the dark at this point and dealing with their family being broken up by the beliefs and instruction of a psychopathic person who calls herself a mental health professional. And as we heard from Jessi and other past clients of Jodi, and as I said a few minutes ago, Jodi is a walking torpedo. She walks into your life with the intent to destroy your marriage and your kids and everything around you. But of course, this does not excuse Ruby and Kevin. It does not matter what someone else is telling you to do. If their instructions literally involve things that will clearly obliterate your home or telling you to tie up your kids and starve them, then it is your job to live in truth and report that so-called expert as a psycho who is abusing their license to destroy the people who come to them for help. And I'm not going to listen to Kevin's lawyer just because he's an expert, as he tries to make excuses for Kevin about why he did not check on his kids for over a year. Even if he didn't know what was happening in Jodi's home to his kids and that the abuse had gotten that extreme, I can't think of any acceptable reason as to why he did not show up on the front porch to confirm that his children were okay. There was literally nothing that anyone could say to me to convince me that isolation from my kids was part of a psychological or medical treatment plan for their health and well-being and for their improvement. So, of course, I mean, you're welcome to think what you want about the sisters. I personally don't think that they should be the target of backlash, at least not at this point, unless there is information that comes to light that they really did know far more than they're saying right now. I just think at this point, the focus does need to be on Jodi, on Ruby, and on Kevin, and making sure that these kids are safe and that justice is served for them. It's astonishing to me that Jodi Hildebrandt wasn't put behind bars sooner. She sounds like she's a very skilled person. She's very manipulative, and she uses her words and her expertise to draw people in only to bring them down. And I think most of us can't even comprehend what it's like to have a brain that functions that way. But I would love to know your thoughts on this in the comments below. Do you think that Kevin deserves any grace, and would it be in the best interest of the kids to put them back in his care? Should Ruby be granted any grace, seeing as clearly the extreme aspects of the abuse appeared to be under the direction of someone who claimed to be a mental health professional? Because I personally don't think so. She doesn't appear to be taking any responsibility for her own part in the egregious treatment of her own children. And honestly, I think that makes a huge difference for most people's cases, is whether or not someone recognizes the errors of their own behavior and shows true remorse versus those who do everything they can to justify their actions and or to blame others. And I don't think Ruby has any remorse right now, which is absolutely horrifying because these were your children. So please like this video, share it with others, help me out in the algorithm, and leave a comment below, even if it's just your favorite emoji. If you feel so inclined, there is a little thanks button that you can donate to the channel and support in that way. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one.